Donuts. That's right. Today we've got the Homer interview, a longtime player and someone I've always thought really highly of, and have enjoyed the articles he's written on Triple Triad, and so was excited to get, his answers to my questionnaire. So let's get into it. How would you describe your Triple Triad player style? Just talking about open here, and trying to remember 13, 14 years ago when I last played a lot. My style was to make intuitively strong-seeming moves at the start of the game before trying to leave the opponent with no good moves to make. I thought of open sometimes as trying to exhaust the opponent's best resources and leave your own in reserve to give the killer blow. I didn't really like full calculation, but I do it sometimes. I think if I play casually, I get much weaker because my sense of a good move is lost, and I'm less inclined to calculate from the start of the game. So this is going to start a lot of times when I just agree with Homer, especially in the sense of I think intuition is what goes when you're not playing as actively, and it's easier to go worse during that time. I also wonder, obviously I don't have records of Homer games, but I think of someone trying to exhaust the opponent's best resources and leave your own in reserve. I think of that as a player who would be quick to block squares the opponent has combo potential in and try to leave your combos open for the late game, and that can certainly be a very effective way to play. Who is your most interesting opponent? Probably Great Sephiroth, just because his 2-minute open games were such a good training ground for coming to quick decisions fast. He was so good at those short time limit games. Yeah, he was incredible. Another thing I wish I had records of is just Great Sephiroth playing 2-minute games, because he so quickly would find the lines that mattered. But also, in the return, I caught one 2-minute open game of his, and I made a video about it. And it's just him very quickly playing these incredibly complicated moves. The opponent starts in 2, and he just captures from 5, open to combos everywhere with some combo pack potential, and leads to this absurdly complex game. And the next 2 moves were very strange as well, from a kind of standard perspective, not that they weren't justified in the game. Fascinating player. Really, really fascinating. Who is your toughest opponent? At my peak of playing strength, the best players were Delial and Seto. I didn't play against Seto much, and even though Delial was great, I enjoyed playing against him because his style led to fun games. But I could never, ever beat Scythe for some reason. Plus, now you have to try and differentiate between Scythe and Scythe for your video. The Scythe he is referring to is Cife, short for Cypheroth, because I believe the Germans spelled Cypher's name Cifer. Scythe, as in serenity or vanity, will not be referred to for the rest of this interview. All references to Scythe will be the one beginning with a C. What formation or move type do you like more than other players do? I think the defensive L formation is almost a hard counter to a strong corner starter, which used to be the default start for many players. I wouldn't say I like any formations, but that one is the formation that made me think the hardest when I play against it, and feels good when I use it. Yeah, one thing that comes to mind is Homer wrote an article that I've returned to many times and used as the basis for a lot of discussion of hands I did in my early videos, was a level 4 hand he talks about, with the corners, as he does examples of different starter types, and I'm in fact soon going to do a series of different starter types, but the sort of the corner hand example he shows is what I have now dubbed the 3-corner or Homer hand, but it starts with a 3-6-7-4 designed to go in 1, and it has a 2-6-3-6 ready to recapture from 2, and a 6-2-6-3 ready to recapture from 4. But the thing that really differentiated it from other hands, because many hands have, had a corner starter and a horizontal and vertical card, each really good at recapturing it one way, was then it had 2 more corner cards ready to recapture the capturers. And I've always found this hand very interesting and liked playing around with hands of this type. But something cool I think he mentioned in that article and was very astute about was that he thought this hand, and corners in general, but this hand I think a really good example, vulnerable to adjacent corners, and that hand indeed I think has a lot of difficulty in a lot of spots meeting adjacent corners, leading to those L setups. And weirdly, for a hand so good at recapturing itself, taking the starter immediately also not a terrible strategy against that hand, because similarly you can aim for L's where that hand has a little bit of difficulty. Do you ever prefer? Then I asked some questions about preferred ways to meet a starter and preferred starter types, and he says, "Don't really have one. Sorry for the boring answer." One thing I actually, like about this interview is for questions Homer is not interested in answering, he will just cheerfully not answer once he doesn't have an answer to. We will also be skipping the questions of should Delial be banned and should Elemental be abolished. He says, "Don't have good answers to these meme questions." So stuff's going to be skipped past. And I think for players that have spent longer away from the game, that also means more of their time was spent at a time when the site had a stronger and bigger community. And I'm much more excited to hear the answers about community and about the stories of their time on Triple Triad. And so these are definitely cases where I don't mind if these answers are skipped past at all. And I sort of wish my questionnaire had more ways to get at that I had done a better job designing it to get more stories of the person's time and valuing their time on Triple Triad Advance. So come to which we have a question that might get at this a bit. What is your proudest Triple Triad moment? I have a few, so this will be more like a brief history of Homer. Perfect. The first one was getting into Card Club and Brotherhood of Seed and TTX. When I first started, they were the elite clans, and it was such an aspiration for me to get into them. Card Club was the dream for me, as they seemed the most prestigious, and part of that was probably CC Ace's non-stop mythologizing, some of which you heard in his interview, but there was a lot more. Yeah, as always, I really like it when people's greatest moments are like earning their way into clans, the kind of achieving your way into a kind of new place on the site seems to me something really cool about the early days, and I really appreciate when that's people's favorite moment. Later, there are little things here and there. I earned a couple of icons in tournaments. I felt like in 2008 I was finally a strong player after having after having never played seriously in the many years before that, and getting to a semi-final followed by a quarterfinal back-to-back seemed good. Though the quarterfinal was actually disappointing for me, since I knocked out Great Sephiroth before losing to Kazik, who I felt I should have defeated. That was in Vincent, where Kazik really beat a murderer's row to make the finals before losing to Turds in the finals. Obviously knocking out Great Sephiroth, enormous achievement. Around that time, I got a little recognition for being a good player too. Delial nominated me for Best Open Player, or maybe Player of the Year for the TTA Awards. I mean, he couldn't nominate himself, so why not Homer? Kazdan told me he thought I was more difficult than Delial to beat. I knocked him out of consecutive tournaments, so maybe he was just feeling the effect of that, though actually I think it was more of a style thing, where I would try and make the games hard for the opponent to find a good move. Delial would just let you play, and then beat you. A couple comments here. One, this is, obviously incredible recognition from other fantastic players. Kazdan, also known as Fusion Cloud, is a tremendous player who's beaten a lot of elite players in tournaments, and Delial is, of course, the best. So, wonderful players to have achieved recognition from. I do think, for me, and maybe this has changed over time, but I think Delial, when he's had time to play you or talk to you, will start adjusting, not just playing his own game well, but will start adjusting really well to make the game very uncomfortable for you. And I think that's something really cool Delial is more capable of doing than anyone else I can think of. So I think that's a cool feature he has. I also think Yojimbo was very, very good at that. He's the other person who comes to mind as really adapting to opponents rather than playing your own game. Yeah, and Homer's run with the quarter and the semis consecutively, and some solid results surrounding it, usually losing to activity, not to an actual opponent, which we'll talk about a bit later, got him into my top 50 all-time tournament players, despite Homer having a pretty short tournament run. He was around a long time, but not particularly active in tournaments, just like a well-known good player in the community, and then really makes a nice run in 08. I also remember when he came back in 09 was after I had gotten really good, and playing him, I think he had drawn Slash of Time in the first round of a tournament, and I have no idea why he picked me, but he asked me to play a practice game with him, and beating him in that practice game was one of the moments where I really felt I had made the leap. And now Homer had been inactive for like 6 months, and as he said here, we know he clearly gets weaker with time. This was not as big an achievement as I felt it was at the time, but it was one of the moments that really stood out to me as like I can now compete really well with some of the great players on the site that have, played a long time. And so that just winning that practice game versus Homer really stood out to me as has stood out to me for a long time as a meaningful signifier of my place. And maybe that's the closest thing I have, not that this interview's about me, but to kind of the moment of getting into one of those prestigious clans by winning a tryout. Because I never really had a moment that felt like that. I got into Zodiac Braves through a tournament, but fittingly, Kazdon activity lost the finals against me, so it never really felt like I earned my place, and at the time Kazdon was beating me every time we played. So I don't really have that kind of moment, and I think the closest thing I have is winning a tournament practice game against Homer, for the kind of feel of earning your place in something. Player you think is the most underrated? Scythe. Because he was a funny guy, I think people didn't respect his ability, but in 2008 or so, he was really good. Plus, most of the TTA gang don't remember some of the really strong players of the previous eras. CC Mickey, CC GOC, CC TNTC, Cliff Blackbolt, CC Shadow, Lionheart, Solid Snake. Try saying CC TNTC 10 times fast. That seems difficult. Anyway, yeah, good answers. Love hearing shoutouts to the past. Who are your top 3 to 5 picks for GOAT? He says his opinion doesn't really matter for this. When did you start playing and what was your favorite era? I started playing around the year 2000 on TT.com. After a while, you could no longer get to the site using the proper URL, so you had to use the IP address instead. I remember it began with 64, but sadly can't remember the whole thing. I'd never heard about this. That's a really fun tidbit. I wonder if anyone else has memories of this. I have 2 favorite eras. First, the TTX era. I was a teenager and just had tons of fun. The community was great, and we lost some great characters after TTX closed, like Karai, Hunk, Ulti, and MLP. My tie for first favorite era was Triple Triad Advanced 2007 to 8, which is when I was most active as a player and community member. I was in great clans like Divas and Triforce. I started recruiting people for Brotherhood of Seed and brought in Midas and Yojimbo. By brought in, I mean I lost to them. I enjoyed talking to people like Kaus, Scythe, Koner, Shuriken, Rhinoa, Spitfire, and many others. The community felt more developed and mature, but still with enough people to have a good time. I feel like Divas and Triforce and Kaus and Shuriken of that era, almost everyone who was part of those clans really, really valued their relationship with Kaus or Shuriken. I think they really are some of the standout clan leaders in Triple Triad history for really making members of their clans feel connected and valued and appreciated, and that was just a really nice trait, really nice clans to be in. I wasn't in Triforce at the time, but you keep running across it in these interviews. Of course, I wasn't in Divas till later either, but the community felt more developed and mature, but still with enough people to have a good time. Favorite rule set? When I played a lot, my favorite was level 6, open, same ++ wall combo, random. I liked level 6 random because it felt like a level without broken cards in it, so the random usually led to fairly even hands. But random also took people out of their comfort zone and forced people to play over the board rather than using prepared lines with their hand. As a chess player, you probably understand that. I think Triple Triad moved... Part of it was because set starter back in the early days, but I think it moved from more hand games to more random games as time moved on. I'd love it if someone who was actually around for a much longer period of time could confirm or deny that. But I think, games are largely... casual games are largely random now. And I think for a while, they were at least a much larger chunk hand games. And some of that is because, even when I was starting 2008, 2009, there was still big influxes of new players. And new players would get, basically play level 4, same ++ wall, maybe combo for a long time, right? And that put people in hand games. And as people got the cards to play other levels, they would start playing more randoms and other things. But it tended to start most people with hand games. And also, of course, there were the people ready to exploit the influx of new players by crushing them over and over again with powerful hands. But I do wonder if it was a move over time from more hand games to more random games. That if we, magically had the numbers of how many were played over time, you'd see a steady decrease of hand games in casual play. But level 6 is also a very interesting choice here. I've always found level 6 a little clunky, and part of that is it doesn't have the super powerful broken cards of level 5, level 7, maybe level 10. It's a level more like level 9, where cards are clunkier and can't do as many multi-purpose things, and you really have to find ways to make them work together rather than the cards just inherently working together. Akiyama in his interview mentioned he really doesn't like level 6-7 because he feels it's too clean, but I think that's mostly the level 7 cards doing it. And level 6 is a favorite set. And I think Jadat was another creative player that really liked level 6. I think is a really interesting choice. Have you met any other Triple Triad players in person? Nope. I would have liked to back in the day, but now too much time has passed. What's your biggest weakness as a player? I have many. A couple that stopped me from being a really good player are, for obviously Homer was a really good player, but from being an echelon above whatever high tier he was in. I never did any focused practice or learning to improve because I saw Triple Triad as a fun and casual hobby. Even at my peak of play skill, I didn't play much, and I didn't even take many tournaments seriously. A second one is that I didn't consider my opponent enough. A good player has a plan to win the game. A great player knows their opponent also has a plan and tries to counteract that. I was very much in the good camp. A final weakness is I tend to play intuitively, which means I need to be playing regularly in order to make good moves. Really empathize with that. My intuition weakens without practice, therefore I couldn't just pick up the game and be back to my old strength quickly. Yeah, very much empathize with that. For me, I was lucky enough to come over from chess, and that fundamentally meant I was going to be a good calculator. And so my skill at calculating covers for when my intuition is weaker. But obviously, if you have less of a calculation basis and less often have the energy to do the calculation, that intuition weakening really, really hurts. But yeah, I really wish I had games of Homer's. I wish with these I could show some games from his Triad Wars 6 run in 2008 or his Vincent run in 2008. It would be so great to get to look at and just be like, yeah, here's Homer's best games. Here are another 3 weaknesses of mine I thought of. I really appreciate this too. Just someone introspecting on their game and not doing, the selling yourself in your glory, but instead thinking about places where you genuinely were behind some of your top competitors. I think is really nice to hear about. So his three more weaknesses. 1. Making blunders in games. I'd use the word punts, which is more Magic lingo, but I've been playing and watching a little chess recently, so the terminology is seeping in. An example, in a tournament game against FF Player 7, who was a decent level player, I had the win in a game before simply making the wrong move and losing. He had calculated my win too, and actually reported the game in my favor, before being surprised at the fact he actually won. Ugh. The second additional weakness is consistency. I'd frequently win a game against a high-level player before losing to one I felt I should beat. The GS Kazakh tourney is an example, but I also recall beating Tezuka in a tournament before losing to someone random the next round. I wanted to measure... Obviously, tournaments are the only things we have serious records of performance in, but I wanted to measure consistency of players, because there are definitely players who reliably beat people weaker and reliably lose to people stronger. And then there are other players who, FF Player 7 is actually a good example, has very good chances to beat a stronger player, Foyer as well, but also will drop games to weaker players. And maybe Homer, though I think Homer is clearly stronger than those two, I think might be in a similar camp of is going to drop matches they probably shouldn't. I do think it can be easy to be misled, and that doesn't mean he is here, but some rule sets are just going to click and some aren't, or you're going to make a hand and it's going to have turned out you went the completely wrong way on the rule set, and that can be really hard to recover from. And if, one rule set really clicked and your hand clicked with the set, you beat someone really, really strong, and then the next rule set doesn't click, your hand doesn't fit it, and suddenly you go out and it feels like you're really inconsistent, but actually it's being good at certain rule sets and not others, or having clicked on a hand with a certain rule set and not others. I'm not sure. But they're definitely like, you look at, who's a good example? You look at someone like Mafi Josie. And Mafi Josie is a great tournament player. But he basically only loses to other great players. Jaws is another one. Jaws might be the best example. Jaws has I think no losses to anyone I haven't ranked in my top 60 tournament players of all time. None. And Jaws played 15 tournaments or whatever. This is and didn't win any of them, so his 15 or so tournament losses. But none of the losses are to anyone who wasn't really, really, really good. And so there was a player who, he loses, but his losses are, Kaus, it's Koner, it's players like that, it's Delhi. And then you see other players who, swing wildly back and forth in results. And I'm not sure what to identify as sort of reasons for higher consistency. Like, what skill would you want to work on to be more consistent? I'm not sure, but I think it is an interesting trait. He also adds, the Great Sephiroth Kazakh tourney is an example, but I also recall beating Tezuka in a tournament before losing to someone random the next round. Finally, activity. The amount of tournaments I lost on activity are really high. They really are. I went back and looked, and there are just so many tournaments lost by activity. And I didn't even count some of them because my records, if you lost in the first round by activity, I just counted as you didn't play the tournament. But if you got past the first round, I list how you got there, so it includes activity losses. And Homer is one of the all-time leaders in most tournaments, like highest percentage of tournaments he dropped out of due to activity. I even lost to Meta in Triad Wars semifinals, which is Homer's farthest run ever, by simply conceding to him after a number of draws because I couldn't carry on playing against him, though I can't remember why. It was my final year of university, so maybe I had exams or something. Final year of university, I think for a lot of players does line up for their most active year, and then leaving university people tend not to be as active on Triple Triad, sadly. Is there another question I haven't asked you'd like to answer? I think you should try and interview people about their community experiences. The CC Ace interview was basically a story of his time in the community, which was excellent, and I think there's some great memories out there. Kaus would be a superb choice. Yeah, I've sort of wanted to hold off interviewing players like Kaus, specifically Kaus, because he's such an important community member, and I don't think my questions do a great job at getting at community stories. And I would really like to figure out what I want to ask in those instances and try to tailor the interviews a bit more. Maybe give the same interview so I have asked the same questionnaire to each person, but add a few questions, maybe change a few. I'm not really sure on that one. If anyone has thoughts on how to do better interviews with kind of players who've been away from the game for longer but were key community contributors, just enormous, I would love to hear it. I also want to go back to one other thing, which is, he said here, he lost the tryout matches to let Yojimbo and Midas into Brotherhood of Seed back in the day. And if you consider Brotherhood of Seed to be kind of the villains of Triple Triad, which, I'm not unbiased, I certainly do in this later era that I've been a part of, then I feel like the conclusion should be Homer is original sin. He's the the guardian of the gate that let this in, and now we have to fight against the dastardly consequences. So if you'd like to blame Homer for that, I'm on board. I would be happy to start a club of no Homers. So dope.